There are a few things which are different. One obvious similarity between the first two is not only concerned with climate change, but of course air. A couple of things which are different. One is that the research that I'm about to report is not nearly as well developed. We call it a pilot study. And it has a lot fewer respondents. But it hopefully is leading us in a useful direction. And it also is an attempt to try to not only understand the sources of the problem, but move us toward possible solutions in terms of the kind of communications which might make a difference. So let's go to the next slide. Even though it is not there's not as much support for the idea or belief in the idea of climate change now as there was a few years ago, it's still the case that a majority of Americans still believe that human-induced climate change is real and is a problem. And therefore in favor of reducing consumption of fossil fuels and support some energy conservation policies. But what kinds? Well, one of the things which has long been pretty clear to many of us is that if you really want to get people to conserve, you increase the fuel tax. It's pretty obvious if you look at the differences between consumption and price in the United States versus Europe. High tax means people use public transportation more, drive more fuel-efficient cars. Not only that, if we use at least informal longitudinal data in the United States, it's also clear that Americans are pretty price sensitive in terms of fuel prices. You know what? It's very clear to remember that both the late 70s and a couple of years ago, when fuel prices went pretty high, people really started buying fuel-efficient cars. Public transportation use substantially increased. And in fact, one of my fond memories of the summer of 2008 is working class guys coming over to me as I was filling my Prius and looking admiringly and saying, now how much fuel economy do you get in that? a brief period of time in which I, attracted attention in a positive way from that. Well, so even though economists and much logical analysis would suggest the best way to reduce fuel consumption is to increase the tax, politicians never propose it, at least not openly, and there's a reason why they don't, which is public opinion surveys have always shown overwhelmingly negative. At least I've started with John Anderson in 1980 suggested that he was derided. O'Connor in the late 90s showed overwhelming opposition to an increase that some of us would regard as moderate, meaning 60 cents per gallon, which would keep it well below European prices. Now, Thomas Friedman has suggested that not only do we need an increase in the fuel tax, but he has suggested a strategy for doing so several years ago. He said, if you get accused of taxing, people who are in favor of it saying, yeah, I'm in favor of an increased tax, but so are my opponents. Only their tax is basically allowing huge amounts of money to go to the treasuries of such friendly nations as Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, and my increase in the tax would have the money go to the United States Treasury where it could be used to serve Americans. So the question is, to what degree is anything that Friedman says possible? And in particular, if you look at how many people oppose it, one conclusion would be that the attitudes are so strong that there's almost no way you can change them. But the other possibility is that people haven't really been presented very much with a cogent argument for increasing the tax, and that if they care about climate change, which many people do, that the attitudes may not be quite as strong as we fear. In other words, there may be a basis of, yes, if you really care about climate change, that provides a wedge. So let's proceed to the next. So what would be important in terms of getting people to support a fuel tax? Well, one thing is Dietz and his collaborators, one of whom's here, like Rachel, I know, have found that awareness of consequences of climate change was a very important predictor of support for policies to reduce fuel consumption, for all policies, and that includes a tax increase on fuel. And this leads me to conclude that concern about climate change is necessary to support increased taxes. Given the anti-tax bias, and figure none of those people would support it if they weren't concerned about climate. But it is very obviously not sufficient. So what else is needed? And another paper by Dietz et al. Finds that people evaluate climate change policies in terms of how well they would achieve the stated goal. And one possible reason that people are negative about such a tax is that they have not been given convincing arguments that a tax would actually work. Okay. Well, so I did basically, on a sociology class, two-phase empirical study. You can see my enormous sample size. So we're not dealing with, well, actually, some of the findings probably are statistically significant, but actually, they definitely are. But nonetheless, it's still a small sample. Done in late January, and I asked them the standard O'Connor et al. Question, which Dietz et al. Had repeated, which is, some people are proposing a 60-cent increase in the gasoline tax. What do you think about that? And we mentioned it as a means of reducing consumption of gasoline. It didn't give reasons, why it should be good, but did say, here's the reason that people have it in mind. Okay, next slide. So what did we find? 11% supported it, 78% opposed it, the others were in between. Okay? I might add, this was a sociology class. This was a class in which a solid majority of the people indicated that they had voted for Obama. So this is probably, this is not a bunch of diehard climate deniers. Just move back for a moment. Okay. We also, aside from asking their reactions to a 60-cent per gallon increase, asked them, well, what's the highest increase that you would consider supporting, given concern for reducing consumption? So the mean was 12.9 cents per gallon. The median was 7.5 cents a gallon, which you can guess would make a tremendous effect on consumption. Okay. So people were also asked to explain their view, and the most common explanations were, one, gasoline was already too expensive as it is, and the other one, this is of course relevant to what Dietz et al. Said, is people need to drive. Driving is not a luxury. People need to drive. So
microphone away from the speaker.
okay. So they will continue to do so even if you increase the tax. You will just be penalizing you. By the way, as I understand it, Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who's at the left wing of the Democratic Party, is concerned about the environment, also has never been enthusiastic about a gas tax. I mean, basically, it's going to hurt a lot of low-income working people, who have, particularly in his state, who have to drive and who have old cars. Okay? So you also asked them, well, how would you feel if the tax had certain features? And one is it phased in gradually, and there was some feeling of, okay, well, it wouldn't be quite so bad. And another is we asked, supposing it was all refunded in the form of other decreases in other taxes, like income tax and payroll tax. And there's some feeling that would make it a little bit more acceptable. The other interesting thing is when we asked, well, what if half of it were refunded in other taxes and the other half was used to improve public transportation? And somewhat to my surprise, people were actually more supportive of using half the tax for public transportation than refunding all of it. The reason being, they said, well, this way would really help reduce consumption even more. Well, we did the same population 5 weeks later, and this time we presented a number of reasons why we both changed the specification of the tax to make it more palatable and gave some persuasive reasons, and we're interested in seeing, could we change things? Now, I want to make clear, we're changing a lot of things at once, so therefore, people will immediately say, well, you don't know what worked, and we don't. It was more, this is try a lot of things, see if something works, and then we will later try to see if we can get the funds to do a bigger study in which we can separate them out. I might add, it's on the same population, but because of anonymity, we had no linking of individual responses. So people were presented either with an argument for reducing fuel consumption in order to prevent consequences of climate change, serious consequences, or one of the things that Friedman also likes to say is presenting it as a means of protecting America's economic competitiveness, like creating a green economy rather than letting all the green jobs go to China, and also stopping sending money to unstable, unfriendly regimes. Next, all were asked their views, the same O'Connor et al. Dietz et al. Question in terms of the gasoline tax, but specifying that the tax is phased in gradually over 4 years. Half of the revenue is used to reduce other taxes, the other half to produce improve public transportation and alternative energy. Next. Okay. Now, doing this alone, the specification, along with the preceding messages, did increase the support. Not dramatically, it's still not anything to, to crow about too much, but it did increase some support from 11% to 18%. It increased strong support from 0% to 9%. But then this is just one message. Then asked them to think about European prices. It asked all their view of a reasonable price of gasoline. It actually, not just that, there's something I didn't think. It then said, what do you think European prices are? It then told them what European prices are. Interestingly, on the average, people weren't all that far off. Most people knew that European prices were higher. I mean, I think the average response was $5.20 for Britain, France, and Germany. And I think he said the correct answer was between $6 and $7 per gallon. It then asked their view of a reasonable price right after that, and okay, we did, they were aware higher than American price. Being asked about European prices did have an important effect. So the mean estimate of a reasonable price actually, in those 2 minutes or less, went up from $2.56 to $3.11. And then, what we then did is say, okay, let's take the most common argument which was given against such a tax increase, the idea that it wouldn't work anyway, and try to refute it. So we present a common argument that gasoline price will not reduce fuel consumption, as most people have no alternative to drive. Okay, so we mentioned several things, many of which I've said earlier. People have ways of reducing their fuel consumption, especially over time. The tax increase will motivate them to do so. So for one thing, we said if it phased in gradually, it would more influence people's decisions about the future rather than punishing them for decisions that they made in the past and can't undo, in terms of the kind of car they bought. Raising the pump price will send a signal to people to purchase more fuel-efficient vehicles, a signal above and beyond the fuel economy standards. Mentioning to people where the tax is high, people do drive more fuel-efficient cars. And mentioning, that we have found in the U.S. that when the price has gone up, people buy more fuel-efficient vehicles, and mentioning that also recently that when gasoline prices were high, especially when they were not just $3 but $4 per gallon, interest in carpooling increased substantially, use of public transportation increased substantially where it was available. And then finally mentioning some of the extra cost in fuel would be refunded by reducing other taxes. Some of the revenue would be used to help develop alternative technologies that don't require fossil fuels. And, okay, and we said, imagine the proposed tax had all these features, phased in gradually, half being reduced to use other taxes, half being used to improve public transportation and alternative energy. And then we went back to the question asked 5 weeks earlier. What is the highest increase that you would support? And what did we find? Instead of 12.9 cents per gallon, the mean was actually 47.2 cents per gallon. The median actually went up even more, from 7.7 to 49 cents per gallon. And now, there are many differences between the two phases. One is that we specified the tax to make it less immediately onerous, as in phased in gradually. Also, we did say some of it would be refunded, talked about the use of others. We gave several persuasive arguments, We asked people about Europe. We don't know how much telling them the information or simply asking them to think about it mattered. It may have been simply asking them to think about it was sufficient, because most of them, at least in that sample, had a good idea. So it's difficult to reach clear conclusions about exactly what caused the change, or actually it could have been a whole bunch of things. One thing which we actually could quantify is that regression analysis in terms of the relationship between people's estimate of a reasonable price and the relationship between that and the tax that they would accept, increase that they would accept, suggests that the 55-cent increase in the reasonable price that came after thinking of European prices was associated with a 16.3 cent per gallon increase in the acceptable tax. That alone made a difference. Okay. So our next steps are we hope to test the following hypotheses. One is, in order to support such a tax increase, people must believe, A, that we must reduce fuel consumption, perhaps for climate change reasons, that a tax increase will have such an effect, and that the tax will not be overly onerous. And we're hoping to start to separate out these things. Belief that the tax will reduce fuel consumption can be strengthened by stating both that part of the tax will be used for public transportation and alternative energy, and by evidence that the demand for gasoline does have some elasticity. In other words, it has some fair amount of response to price. Our proposed method is there is a group called Time-Sharing Experiments for the Social Science, which is an NSF infrastructure project that offers researchers opportunities to test their experimental ideas on large, diverse, and randomly selected subject populations. Basically, they would, if they approved our proposal, they would ask a random sample of the United States to do an internet survey, which we present the messages and get their responses. And so the virtue of tests is it allows experimenters to capture the internal validity of experiments while realizing the benefits of contact with a large, diverse population. In other words, not just college students. Okay, so at the moment, we're thinking in terms of a factorial design, at least two independent variables. One, we might put in the European price, but but we actually have a couple of others. One is what's well known is that people don't respond as well to climate change, or what's well hypothesized is because they figure, well, we can't worry all that much about the future. It's still distant. We'll deal with that when it comes. We've got more immediate problems. So one possibility is, it's well known by the scientific literature that things will get worse over time. So should one emphasize moderately serious consequences predicted for 5 years hence, say 2015, or the more serious consequences predicted for 2030? That's one possibility. And of course, another is a control, not bothering people, not predicting anything serious, not mentioning that. Another thing relates to the effectiveness of the tax. So one would be a higher tax, the most effective way to do all of the following: purchase more fuel-efficient cars, carpool, and use public transportation. That would be one condition. Another would be the revenue can help Americans by being partially refunded by reducing other taxes, and partially used to improve public transit. And there can be a control condition with none. I might add, by the way, that Cantwell-Collins, as I understand it, has some resemblance to what we're talking about, which is it does involve some kind of a tax, but it also refunds. I think it mostly refunds rather than using it for public transportation. But that's deliberately designed for, palatability. Now, one of the things which we still haven't decided is, instead of just what the tax will decrease consumption, the tax, that's one condition, the tax being, will help Americans in these ways. We could possibly have another one, which is, do both work noticeably better than either alone? That's still another possibility. And that's it. Questions? Yeah. Yes, and that's
So,
Julie.
I was wondering, the magazine Atlantic Monthly, they have a factoid sheet, and they give you numbers. So one of the numbers I remember reading was that the average gasoline price since Hurricane Katrina has gone up something like $1 a gallon, a little bit more than that. And then you can back calculate what percentage of that goes to oil companies versus, say, the government and taxes. I'm sort of wondering, in terms of persuasive messaging, if you use that as opposed to Europe, if that would make a difference, because then all the variables are the same. People still have to drive the same distance. It affects people exactly the same way. You sort of talk about the fact that the gasoline prices have almost doubled and stayed that way in the last 6 years. If that would maybe change, if you thought about that.
That's an interesting thought. I think if you could persuade people, there's two possible mechanisms for persuading people that would be using that. One is to say that if we raise the tax, we are to some degree substituting for the income that's going for the oil companies. Yeah, then that might work. I suppose the other one is saying, compared to the other aspects of the tax, it's not all that much. I think what tends to happen in people's minds and why they don't, when they usually present it and support it, is sort of thinking, it's gone up enough already. I don't need an additional. It's already reached my threshold of pain. But you have a very interesting idea in terms of how to at least partially deflect that. Yeah? Sean.
Some of what you said is, I think it rings untrue in that.
Untrue?
Yes.
Okay.
Though I believe the taxes work, one of the things that was publicized and is fact is that the oil companies made record profits. I mean, like humongous record profits in that period of time. And yes, consumption went down. So why should we, as the American public, pay more to give them more money, whoever gives it, and do it that way? The other problem would be Europe. A comparison between Europe and the United States is not fair. A lot of their taxes go to healthcare and education and what have you. Whereas a better comparison, because of the size of the country, might have been Canada, where their taxes, their fuel prices are relatively the same, a little higher, about $1 higher. I was actually had a tax increase. More of that.
Yeah, well, it's under the 60-cent increase, if that's really more bringing it to Canadian style than to European style prices. And of course, Canada is a big spread out country, unlike Europe, so certainly got a point there. As far as you're saying that it goes to, I'm not sure, were you saying that people will think that tax increase is simply enriching the oil companies?
Well, there's a fact that the oil companies made humongous, I forget the number, like $43 billion profits from like ExxonMobil, Microsoft. That's why are they making such record profits when we're suffering? Is one of the concerns that I would have. And then the other part is, as you said, is that the effect on those record profits on the poor.
Okay, well, I think that could actually be used as an argument for the tax. And instead of sending our money to the oil companies and to foreign countries, let's send it to our own treasury. In any case, that's all certainly worth thinking about in terms of where the profits come. Rachel.
I think there's a piece from NPR that had Dan O'Reilly talking about, sort of behavioral economists talking about people at the gas pump filling their tanks and how we're particularly sensitive to that. Like, if we're in the grocery store buying yogurt from week to week, you may not notice the price fluctuation so much, but pumping your gas, right, you stand there and you watch the price and the dollars and that because I wonder if it's easier to tax something else or like high MPG card or some other way to get at that gas tax in particular is really specific that people are sensitive to those prices because of the actual purchasing process.
Just looking at it, and of course they do fluctuate more dramatically than some other things. Yeah, it's possible. Yes?
In the data sets for the fuel tax attitudes research collects information about whether people who are answering the questions have an experience of living in an urban environment or it being in Europe where there's really efficient, well-constructed public transportation rather than in a small town where you have a bus that comes once an hour and it can be really frustrating to use public transportation. That may
Yeah, I think that you made a very good point, that yes, people's attitude towards using public transportation will vary by where they live and how much it's available. And I would assume, although I haven't seen data, that in places like New York City, that you would have more acceptance of it because there is public transportation. And in fact, increasing the gas tax will affect people a lot less, if there are people who regularly take public transportation to work. So, yeah, I think that is something we certainly will want to know. Yes?
Instead of proposing a politically charged tax, why don't you attack the oil subsidies? Wouldn't that decrease consumption as well?
Which subsidies?
If you got rid of the oil company
The
subsidies.
question was, why don't we attack oil subsidies?
Yeah,
Okay, which subsidies are you talking
like the
about?
depletion allowances.
I thought that, wasn't the depletion allowance repealed?
I thought it was. The others in the room,
Yeah. Well, I think, let me just make a general comment, that ultimately, if you, there are various ways to get increased revenue for the government, some of which, which happen, would have certain benefits. But those ways will not, in and of themselves, decrease consumption. There are all kinds of ways to get revenue into the government, and even take revenues away from the oil companies, only some of which would decrease
Wouldn't
consumption.
that, if you take revenues away, aren't they gonna raise their prices, and wouldn't that decrease consumption?
Well, okay, so you're saying if you take revenue away, would they raise their price? Well, possibly, but in that case, they would argue you've had a policy which has increased the tax on the consumer, so, is there a political advantage to that?
They might be.
The other, just to interject too, the O'Connor battery of items, staff,
Yeah.
and I always use. Bob O'Connor's a political scientist, who's now a National Science Foundation. He develops some standard items about policy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, basically. There are some items in there that talk about removing subsidies, and those are overwhelmingly endorsed in every sample.
Yeah, right,
So,
but
so one reason not to study that is, well, people are already there. They don't like subsidies. When you ask them about subsidies, the oil companies, they don't like it.
And I think, but let me comment, that one of the reasons that that's an easy sell is that, it's often easy to say, well, let's tax the oil companies, is people, at least when you pose it that way, don't think about the possible consequences of, well, if you do remove tax breaks, some of it's going to come back to hit you as a consumer anyway. And I think that's why it's a much easier sell, because of lack of understanding about that. Yeah?
I guess one of the questions I have, and it's really interesting, but one of the questions I have is who would we be trying to convince that this approach would be important? And if I go back to the previous presentation, am I trying to convince a group that has already made up their mind one way or another, or based on your class design, albeit sort of the trial design, am I trying to convince a population that's already willing to accept in some fashion, or at least predisposed to understand this trade-off between, all right, I'm willing to increase the tax if it's going to public transportation? I would suggest that that's a fairly willing or fairly willing audience to accept those trade-offs. Would that willingness change if the question was framed such around something like national security? Would you be willing to accept the tax if it went towards national security, if it went towards public transportation? I think you target different groups, and their willingness to accept would be a function of what they already believe to be important.
I agree. And in fact, Weiss-Arowitz and his collaborators have suggested there are about 6 different groups of people in terms of their attitudes, and have suggested that you present different arguments to different people for maximizing effectiveness. And some of the people who really don't believe in climate change, one of the ways to approach them would be the national security argument. So even if you don't believe in climate change, here are some other good reasons in terms of national security or America's economic efficiency. The world is going toward energy efficiency anyway. China is increasing energy efficiency. The world, almost most of the countries of the world are. Do you want to be towards the beginning of that trend, or do you want to be coming in later and being way behind? So that's certainly another possible variable to look at least at some point. Yeah, Mike?
There was a point in the presentation where it seemed like the reference to European standards or norms could be the most effective argument, but I missed why that wasn't chosen for one of the variables.
You missed it for a good reason, which is it wasn't stated. Okay. Well, you know, some of it involves, we're trying to think of a not overly complex design at one time. So we think of the things which seem, at least at the moment, more theoretically compelling. But we could go do the European or the Canadian, if not in the first stage, maybe in the next stage, to see how much difference that would make.
I would just want to interject again on this, one of my standard talking points is that the lack of funding. That the program to which Stan and Aaron are talking about going is a superb program, but the proposal is going to be driven by contributions to fundamental knowledge, not contributions to understanding climate change. It is National Science Foundation, sociology, or other, and they're going to say, okay, how does this improve these areas of science? And so that's why they've got to go with what's going to be theoretically interesting. And there's no comparable place to go right now, hoping that will change, to say this is really important to understanding climate change. Or, you know, why Riley has to depend on Gallup surveys instead of having money to do a survey every year that he designs himself, because we just don't have. In fact, the funding for human, I have to put this commercial in, the funding for human dimensions research on climate change or global environmental change in the federal government, in the 20 years there's been a federal global change research program, the social science portion of that budget has declined over time, even as every National Academy of Studies says this is critical and we need to increase funding in this area.
Just comment, in terms of tests, my recollection is that policy relevance is one of their concerns. And so, you know, being a fundamental advance in theory may not be as crucial if one can persuade them that this is important to know for policy purposes. That's what we're hoping.
Yes, they wouldn't fund it if it just because it's important for policy. It's got to.
Okay. Yes.
Has any thought been given whether this tax could be a state tax as opposed to a federal tax, and would people accept that differently?
You know, I don't recall any studies which have really looked at whether it would be perceived differently. But actually, I can tell you one thing. Another study, a survey that I participated in, which was from the entire state of Michigan. We were interested in looking at attitudes toward public transportation. And what we found was, to summarize it in one sentence, people were in favor of it in principle, but unwilling to use it if it had any inconvenience or if it cost as much as it probably needs to cost. Okay? The other thing was we asked people, you know, what do you think of Michigan's roads? And most people said, oh, they're terrible. And then I was asked, well, would you be willing to pay more of a fuel tax in order to get the roads up to the standards of those in Ohio, which are not as bad? The majority said no. Yes?
I'm with the Michigan Department of Transportation. I don't know about the study, but we've been trying for 3 years to get the legislature to raise the state gas tax just 4 cents, and it's not happening. So if you could start surveying them first.
You should be asking for 50.
Maybe we should. Thank you, Stan.